bringing his 8 years as the Chittenden County State's Attorney, the DA for this county, to D.C., Senator Patrick Leahy has been a justice reform leader in this state, in this nation, and internationally. He's led the international effort to ban landmines, championed the rule of law domestically and abroad, sought to minimize racist sentencing disparities in our drug laws, strengthened the Second Chance Act, and pioneered a new restorative justice initiative I am sure he will mention in a moment. His leadership has become exponentially important in light of the retirement announcement by Justice Kennedy. No pressure, sir. It is a great personal honor that I present to this conference the senior senator from Vermont, Patrick Leahy.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor. You know, it is nice to be home. And Marcel and I was thinking we're here. It is a little bit different when we started dating and she was a young student nurse and with a curfew. Nuns. God bless them. And but we would, but she could stay out past the curfew if she was studying at university library. So we spent a lot of time at the library studying. And in August, when we celebrated our 56th wedding anniversary, just think what UVM did for us. You know? Let me also talk about somewhere else, Vermont Law School, and what you've done in bringing people together. You have so many leaders in restorative, justice communities from as close as Vermont to as far as Australia. And that's pretty darn impressive. I think of the praise Vermont Law School gets everywhere I go. And you know, some of you may not know this, the first woman ever to be the parliamentarian, the person who's really the boss in the United States Senate, is a Vermont Law School graduate. And Elizabeth does a superb job, and she told me to behave today when I'm up here. But you created the Center for Justice Reform at Vermont Law School. I'm very supportive of that. It understands the urgent need to address our incarceration practices. That's not just something for your students to look at, that's for something for the whole country, and I hope parts of the world to look at. You've helped change lives for people who have been given a second chance who would have been warehoused otherwise. You've been a champion of second chances for many years, dating back to your young days as a prosecutor in Windsor County. And I was a young prosecutor back here when it was a single-person office in Chittenden County. And you've heard me say this at prosecutors' meetings. It was really the best job I ever had, although the last time I said that at a statewide prosecutor meeting, several hands went up and said, we'll trade. But I think that if you are a prosecutor, you realize the responsibility because you have the ability to bring charges or not bring charges. It's where you exercise discretion, as you did in so many places. It also tells me how I approach criminal justice matters in the Senate. Certainly when I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, or my position as vice chairman of the Appropriations Committee, where I pass on the funding for all our federal law enforcement and courts. I made a priority to bring justice and fairness into our justice system. I've worked with a bipartisan group, and in fact, an interesting group that goes across the political spectrum, of senators to reduce mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders. One size does not fit all, and we've got to show that. It's left behind perverse racial disparities within our justice system. Somebody said to me once in a big city, you're a well-respected professional, white professional, and Friday afternoon your drug dealer comes and sells you $200 or $300 worth of powder cocaine. And if you're caught, they're going to say, my gracious, how'd they ever do that? They're going to be sentenced to 3 weekends of community service. If you're a black kid in the inner city and you buy the same amount of money of crack cocaine, you're going to go to prison for a long time. Where are you going to get a job when you get out? Now, I think Congress is beginning to understand slowly that we can't afford to pursue wasteful, ineffective, so-called get-tough policies. Earlier this year, with a bipartisan vote of 16-5 in the Senate Judiciary Committee, including some of the top conservatives, we advanced legislation known as the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. It will begin to address. It doesn't do everything I want, but it's a huge start. Permits more judicial discretion so that low-level offenders, many of whom will get out of prison at some point, will have a real opportunity to become productive members of our communities. And I hope, of course, it will depend upon Majority Leader McConnell, a conservative Republican, to bring it up on the Senate floor. I predict it will pass with Republicans and Democrats voting for it. I've long championed the Second Chance Act, which since 2008 has provided more than 600 grants to communities to support successful reintegration and reduce recidivism. I'm currently working with Senator Portman to reauthorize these critical programs, and I guarantee you I'll get the money for them in the Appropriations Committee. Because we recognize, not just Vermont, but all over the country, the importance of transitional housing, job training, community justice centers, and reducing the needs for prison beds. Not only does it cost less, but the community and society is better off. And sometimes you do something just because it's the right thing to do. Wouldn't that be nice? And I championed a lot of these things in Judiciary Committee. Now I'm doing it in the Appropriations Committee. In the Senate's 2019 federal spending priorities, which we'll pass, I've included $3 million in new funding for the establishment of a National Center for Restorative Justice. It'd be a national leader. I'm glad to see that we don't have people suddenly holding up signs. What are you doing with our taxpayers' dollars when we should be building a wall? Sorry, that was... Oh, hell, I couldn't resist. But it'd be a national leader. It'd advance new ideas. It would transform our justice system. Here's what it'd do. It'd bring together local and state and national and international leaders in this field to establish community-based solutions. No one group has all the answers. Let's work together. And the basis of its establishment is the work that's being done right here in Vermont, at Vermont Law School, and elsewhere. Now, we still have a ways to go before the National Center is realized, but mass incarceration is a crisis that cannot be ignored. It is a blight on our country. And I'm grateful, and I must say this as Vice Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, that the majority of members, Republicans and Democrats, on the Appropriations Committee have agreed with me. And a final note, I still serve as a senior member of the Judiciary Committee. We will have some issues coming up this fall. There was one, oh, yes. The president has been given a list from a conservative group of who he's allowed to appoint or nominate to the U.S. Supreme Court. I shouldn't be so flippant about it. It is a serious matter. I was thinking of that as I got on the plane last night from Washington to come home. I was thinking of it this morning. I was looking out over the fields at our home here in Vermont. And how peaceful and how wonderful it was standing there, looking at that piece of property that we remember from when we spent part of our honeymoon there. And then I think of what can happen if we have a Supreme Court that has to vote certain ways on issues, must vote a certain way on an issue, no matter what the facts are. We have it's a troubling and tumultuous period in our country. Constitutional norms, American ideals are being tested and strained in ways that few would have thought possible. Now, I did not agree with many of Justice Kennedy's opinions, but I voted for him, and I respected his independence. I respected his willingness to recognize the innate rights of all Americans as equals, all Americans as equals. And if President Trump attempts to replace Justice Kennedy with an extreme nominee outside the mainstream, we face the prospect of a Supreme Court that will undo Justice Kennedy's legacy, but will do lasting damage to the hard-won rights of the most marginalized in our society. I'm not concerned about my rights being trampled. I'm a United States Senator. I live in a state where it is. I'm concerned about millions and millions of Americans who do not have the freedom to get the best of lawyers, do not have the freedom to stand up for their rights, who are seeing their voting rights being taken away, or seeing their housing rights being taken away, seeing their rights that all of us should have being taken away. And I'm concerned that anyone who passes President Trump's litmus test for judges will not be capable of rising above politics and providing a check against this administration's many excesses. I've been here with 8 presidents, Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republican and Democrat nominees for judges. But I have never seen a president who will treat the courts, the independent courts, as an arm of the White House, the independent Supreme Court as an arm of the White House. The federal judiciary is one of the 3 co-equal branches of government. It is not a branch of the government that responds to the tweets from one person in the executive branch. It should not happen. And I don't say this as a Democrat. As I said, I've voted for a lot of Republican judges. I've worked with Republican and Democratic presidents. But I've always said I do it as a United States Senator, as a member of a co-equal branch of government. Of the 100 people who are supposed to represent all Americans and be the conscience of the nation. And I do not want to see that conscience torn apart. I do not want to see the independence of our courts torn apart. I do not want to see a president saying a federal judge could not do the right thing because he's Hispanic. Come on. Come on. We are greater than that as a nation. And I'm concerned that the rights of consumers and workers and vulnerable Americans will be expendable in favor of the wealthy and the powerful. I'm concerned that a woman's right to choose has never been so at risk in the 45 years since Roe versus Wade. And I am concerned that just as our country has embraced an individual's right to marry whomever they choose, marriage equality is now at risk as well. But do I expect President Trump to follow the Constitution and seek the advice, not just the consent, of the Senate when he submits his nominee? Well, I think of my Irish and my Italian ancestry, and I'm optimistic, but not that optimistic, because he has a so-called short list. It was compiled by special interest groups that represent only a narrow fraction of the American people. And that's not enough. Look around this room. Everybody here is a United States citizen, comes with different backgrounds. You may have different political beliefs. You ought to all be represented, not just some. So I'm urging him to change course, to consider the rights of all Americans, not just a few special privileged ones. Under the so-called Mitch McConnell rule, there's no rush to fill this seat. Good, I thought you'd get that one. The American people deserve a chance to have their voices heard. You know, the president should show the courage that President Obama displayed and try to find a consensus mainstream nominee who could receive bipartisan support in the Senate. It would strengthen the credibility of the United States Supreme Court at a time when its credibility is being diminished. So, anyway, it's a beautiful day. I don't mean to give you a lecture, but I want to get some of these things off my chest. And Professor, you gave me an opportunity too, so those of you who are visiting, enjoy our great state. Enjoy our great big beautiful lake. That's an inside joke, and the Vermonters will explain it to you later. And you could not be in a better place. Thank you for coming, and Professor, thank you. Okay. They said I can answer a couple questions as long as I behave myself. Anybody have a question? Marcel just said, why start now? Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you for articulating the challenges in front of us in terms of the Supreme Court. Given the seriousness of this challenge, what advice do you have for us?
Well, I think you have to continue to make your voices heard in everything. I can say this because I'm not up for re-election this fall, but there are a lot of cases around the country. Had the control of the Senate not changed 4 years ago, Merrick Garland would be on the Supreme Court, and a man that both Republicans and Democrats have praised, a voice of moderation, and in a totally unprecedented, because Mitch McConnell's party had a 2-vote majority, he did something that had never been done in the history of the country. Even though we all take an oath to uphold the Constitution, which says advise and consent, he said, no, we'll wait till after the election. And we ended, somebody who was on a short list of one special interest group. So I think people around the country have got to look, do they have Senate races this year? A change in the Senate might bring us back to having more moderate. I don't want a super liberal or a super conservative on the Supreme Court. I want somebody who's representative of all of us. And we can do that, but only if we get the Senate back. If we don't, forget it, because the courts, the district courts, courts of appeals will be forever changed, and we will not see some of the progress we've had now. We've already seen it on gerrymandering that cut out non-whites and others from voting. We see that. Take one more, or anybody else? Yes, sir.
Hey, Senator Leahy,
Oh.
how are you? It's Karen. Senator Leahy, you have been the champion for the Violence Against Women Act for many years. And in the last reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, you were instrumental in introducing the most progressive changes in that law that we've seen in the history of the law. The reauthorization, as you know, is coming up again quite shortly, and I'm wondering what you might have up your sleeve to continue the progressive march of that bill. So thank you very much, and thank you so much for your continued support.
Well, thank you, Karen. We've had, and Joe Biden, when he was in the Senate, did a great job on the Violence Against Women Act. But when it came up for reauthorization, I was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I could see there's a whole lot of areas we should change in it. And I went to a very conservative Republican from Idaho, Mike Crapo, and said, let's work together on this. And so we added Native Americans. We added the LGBTQ community. We added sexual trafficking of children. We put all that in. And he got a lot of pressure from Senator McConnell and others to drop off this. He said, no, he's old school. He'd given his word to me, and I gave mine to him, and we passed it. It went to the House, and the so-called Freedom Caucus tried to change it. They didn't. And a Republican Native American, Tom Cole, stood up and fought for it, had the Democratic caucus behind it, and we passed it verbatim. The Leahy Crapo bill passed the House verbatim. Usually can't get this kind of consensus that the sun rises in the east. And when President Obama signed it, Marcel and I were there, and it was such a proud moment. The stories we heard, the people who said, we weren't covered before, but now we are. And in this state, the constant support I got from you and from others made it possible. So now to your question, are we going to get it through? It is at the absolute top of my priorities. We have to get it reauthorized. It is an honest thing to do. And I still have nightmares when I think of some of the cases I went to as a state's attorney at 3 o'clock in the morning, where a battered woman with no place to go, until now, the place she was going was the morgue. There was no programs, nothing to help. We can never go back to that time. So with that, I will thank you and let you go out and enjoy this day. Thank you very much.